It was a date written as I-500 in a faded margin of a translated Bible, not 1,500, just a single letter and 3 numbers. That number struck me before the story did. I wasn't even looking for chronology. I was tracing translation differences between early printed scriptures and later standardized editions, minor shifts in phrasing, subtle changes in tone. But then I saw it. I-500. Not once, but repeated across several early references. In some places, carefully overwritten. In others, left untouched, like a hesitation frozen in ink. In seminary timelines, everything is clean, linear, anchored. The life of Christ sits at the center, dividing history into before and after. Centuries stack neatly, events follow in sequence, and the early church expands in a documented, almost mechanical progression. By the time you reach the medieval period, the structure feels complete. But that's where the anomaly begins. Because outside of those timelines, in physical records, in marginal notes, in early print inconsistencies, there are fractures, dates that don't align. Not in the sense of minor error, but in the sense of a system being rewritten. The I that could mean Yesu, or simply one. The ambiguity is small, almost invisible. But if interpreted differently, it doesn't just shift a year, it shifts an entire millennium. And that raises a quiet question. What if some of the time we think we understand was added later? I didn't arrive at that question directly. It emerged slowly, through patterns. The more I compared early texts to their later standardized versions, the more I noticed how often numbers were clarified, Roman numerals expanded, abbreviations resolved, margins cleaned. Standardization is supposed to preserve truth, but it also has a way of smoothing out irregularities, and history rarely begins smooth. If the date I-500 was ever read differently, if it once pointed to a different reference system entirely, then the timeline we inherited might not be as fixed as we assume. Not fabricated, not invented, but adjusted. And adjustments leave traces. Sometimes they appear not in what is written, but in what no longer fits. I started seeing those traces when I stepped outside the texts and into the data. The year 536 appears in almost every serious reconstruction of early climate history. Not as a footnote, but as a rupture. Tree rings narrow abruptly across multiple continents. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica carry layers of volcanic ash dense enough to dim sunlight for years. Contemporary accounts, Byzantine, Irish, Chinese, describe a sun that gave no light, a sky that held a permanent haze, summers without warmth. This wasn't local, it was global. In the official narrative, 536 is acknowledged as a climatic anomaly, a bad year, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption, or two. The consequences are described in terms of crop failure, famine, political instability. But when you look closer, the language in those accounts becomes less agricultural. Procopius writes that the sun shone like the moon. Cassiodorus speaks of a world where shadows disappeared. In some chronicles, there are references to cold lasting over a decade, not a season, not a cycle, a span long enough to erase continuity. And that's the part that doesn't fit cleanly into the timeline. Because history, as it's taught, continues almost uninterrupted. Empires weaken, yes, but they don't vanish overnight. Cultural transmission persists. Records evolve. There is no visible gap large enough to suggest a systemic break. But dendrochronology doesn't care about narratives. It records stress, silence, interruption. And in the layers corresponding to the mid-6th century, that interruption is undeniable. Some researchers call it the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, a technical term, contained, defined. But others, quietly, have noted something else, a clustering of crises. Plague emerges not long after. The Justinianic plague, one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, begins in the 540s. Trade routes collapse, urban populations decline sharply, written records in some regions become sparse, then fragmentary. It's not just a bad year, it's a cascade. And cascades have a way of breaking systems. If you were mapping a continuous timeline, one that stretches from antiquity into the medieval world, you would expect transitions, gradual shifts, overlapping cultures. But around this period, something compresses, not disappears entirely, but compresses, as if multiple events were later organized into a structure that feels smoother than the reality that produced them. And that brings us back to the question of time. Because if a global event had the power to disrupt not only societies, but the systems that record them, what happens to chronology in the aftermath? What happens to dates when continuity itself is fractured? I wasn't looking for lost empires when I came across the 1944 decree. It surfaced while I was cross-referencing map revisions, comparing pre-20th century atlases with their later standardized editions. At first, the changes seemed routine. Borders shift, names evolve. Cartography, like language, adapts. But then, there was Tartary. Not a city, not a region, an expanse. Across European, Russian, and even some early American maps, Tartary appears consistently, sometimes labeled as Great Tartary, sometimes divided into sub-regions. It spans vast portions of northern Asia, stretching across what we now call Siberia and beyond. In official historical teaching, this label is explained as a vague European term, an umbrella name for lands that were not yet fully explored or politically defined, a placeholder, a misunderstanding. But the consistency is what lingers. Different mapmakers, different countries, different decades, same name. And then, almost suddenly, it's gone. By the mid-20th century, the term disappears from standard cartography, not gradually phased out, but replaced, reclassified, absorbed into a new, more rigid geopolitical language. The 1944 reference I found wasn't a single global command. It wasn't that simple. It was a cluster of administrative actions, academic standardizations, and institutional directives occurring within a narrow framework. Soviet cartographic reforms, educational restructuring, centralization of historical narratives during and after the war. Nothing overtly labeled as erasure, but the effect is similar. A name used for centuries becomes obsolete. And once a name disappears, so does the question of what it referred to. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, because the mechanism isn't dramatic, it's procedural. Archives burn, sometimes accidentally, sometimes during conflict. Libraries are relocated, documents are reclassified. Educational systems adopt unified standards. Terminology is updated for clarity. Each step, on its own, is explainable. Together, they reshape memory. And when I placed this alongside the anomalies in early biblical dating and the disruptions around 536, a quiet alignment emerged. A global event capable of fracturing continuity, followed by centuries where records become inconsistent, then, much later, a period of intense standardization, of maps, of texts, of timelines. Not rewriting history, but stabilizing it. The question is not whether Tartary was a unified empire or merely a cartographic convenience. The question is why such a large and consistent label could vanish so completely and so cleanly within a system that claims to preserve continuity. Because if a geographical concept can be dissolved through standardization, what happens to time? The deeper I went, the less the gaps looked like accidents. They began to resemble alignment. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, is often presented as one of the most stable anchors we have. Each ring corresponds to a year. Growth reflects climate. Wide rings signal abundance. Narrow rings record stress. It's a biological archive. And unlike written history, trees don't revise themselves. When researchers map ring patterns across regions, they expect continuity, overlaps, cross-matching sequences that extend timelines backward with precision. But in certain datasets, particularly around the early medieval period, there are irregularities. Not everywhere, but enough to raise questions. Some sequences don't align cleanly. Others require bridging, statistical interpolation to connect fragments where physical samples are missing or insufficient. In isolation, this is normal. Organic records are never perfect. But when those same periods coincide with sparse written documentation, the gaps begin to echo each other. Ice cores tell a similar story. Layers of atmospheric deposition, volcanic ash, sulfur, particulates, build year by year, like pages in a frozen archive. Around the mid-6th century, those layers spike, then fluctuate, then stabilize. Again, the official explanation is sound: volcanic activity, climatic shifts, natural cycles. But what stands out is not the cause, it's the discontinuity. A moment where multiple independent systems, biological, atmospheric, textual, register stress at once. And then recovery. But not a clean one. A staggered return, as if different regions resumed at different speeds, as if continuity itself had to be reconstructed locally rather than preserved globally. This is where the timeline becomes negotiated. Because when later historians attempt to assemble a continuous sequence from fragmented inputs, they rely on correlation, on aligning events, synchronizing reigns, reconciling calendars. And sometimes that requires adjustment. Not falsification, alignment. A reign extended here to match a known event, a gap filled to maintain sequence, a conversion between calendar systems that introduces slight drift. Individually, these are minor, but across centuries, they accumulate. And if there was ever a period where the underlying data was disrupted, where records thinned, where chronology fractured, then the reconstruction that followed would carry those adjustments forward, smoothed, stabilized, taught as continuous. But beneath that continuity, the seams remain. And once you start seeing them, they appear in unexpected places, in dates that don't quite reconcile, in parallel events that seem compressed, in the quiet redefinition of reference points, like a single letter in a date resolved into a number. I.500. A mark that could anchor time to a different system entirely, or simply a notation later standardized for clarity. The distinction is subtle, but its implications are not. Because if chronology had to be reconstructed after a rupture, whether climatic, cultural, or archival, then the timeline we inherited may reflect not just what happened, but what could be aligned. And alignment, by its nature, leaves something out of frame. Which brings us back to the pattern. A rupture around 536, a thinning of records, a long arc of reconstruction, and, much later, a wave of standardization, of texts, of maps, of dates. Not a single event, a sequence. And sequences suggest intention, even when none is stated. So the question isn't whether history was altered, it's whether it was stabilized. And if so, what was lost in the process of making it seamless? I went back to the texts after that. Not the widely circulated editions, the ones already harmonized and footnoted, but the earlier printings. Margins still uneven, pagination inconsistent, small typographic decisions left visible as if the structure hadn't fully settled yet. That's where patterns tend to linger. In several of these editions, dates are not always expressed in the same system. Some references anchor events from creation, others from Christ. Occasionally, both appear on the same page, separated by a small annotation, barely explained. In seminary teaching, this is addressed as a matter of calendrical diversity, different cultures, different starting points, eventually unified for clarity. But the transition itself is rarely examined in detail. Because when systems of time are converted, something has to give. A year in one system does not always correspond neatly to a year in another. Offsets are introduced, interpretations are made. And in some cases, entire spans are recontextualized to maintain narrative flow. It's not deception, it's translation. But translation, especially across centuries, can reshape structure. One example appears in the way early chronologies handle the so-called dark centuries, periods where fewer records survive, where genealogies become compressed, where reigns seem to stretch or overlap in ways that require explanation. Officially, these are gaps in preservation. But when you place them alongside the environmental disruptions of the 6th century and the later standardizations of the 18th and 19th centuries, they begin to form a bridge that connects rupture to reconstruction. During the Enlightenment, there was a clear push towards systematization. Histories were compiled, cross-referenced, and organized into coherent timelines. Biblical chronology was aligned with secular history. Dates were fixed, discrepancies reduced. Again, not an act of concealment, an act of consolidation. But consolidation has a direction. It moves towards coherence. And coherence, by necessity, reduces ambiguity. The letter becomes a number. I-500 becomes 1500. A marginal notation becomes a standardized date. A regional name becomes a political boundary. A fragmented century becomes part of a continuous sequence. Individually, these changes improve clarity. Collectively, they reshape perception. Because once a system is stabilized, it becomes difficult to see what came before it. The irregularities fade, the alternatives are archived or discarded. And over time, the stabilized version becomes indistinguishable from the original. That's the quiet mechanism. Not erasure through removal, but erasure through replacement. A cleaner version that no longer requires the questions the earlier one provoked. And that's where the pattern loops back. A global disruption, a period of fractured records, a long process of alignment, and finally, a standardized narrative that feels complete. But completeness can be deceptive, because it depends on what was chosen to remain and what was resolved into something simpler. So when we look at biblical chronology today, at the neat division of eras, the precise dating of events, the seamless progression from antiquity to the medieval world, we're seeing the result of that stabilization, not necessarily the raw sequence of events, but the version that could be aligned, translated, and preserved. Which leaves one question, not about what is written, but about what was adjusted to make it fit. What else is hidden behind what we now call a poetic description?